If you took one of your shoes to an expert somewhere else, would he be able to look at it and say, "Oh, that's a Bill Makowski shoe"?
Sure, it's got my name on it.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. After today's show, you're never going to look at a pair of snowshoes the same way again. We're going to Milford to visit Bill Makowski, who is famous for the snowshoes he makes and renowned for his folkloric knowledge of snowshoe making throughout North America. Now, this show has sat on Bill's couch before, 2 years ago, in fact, because he's also known for his pack baskets and fishing creels. Basically, if you can bend brown ash to do something useful, Bill knows how to do it, and he does it made to order in his Bill Makowski's Traditionals workshop in the banks of the Penobscot River. Today, it's all about snowshoes. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. Now, Bill probably isn't going to like this when I say it, but he is a walking encyclopedia about snowshoe making. He's been all over North America, learning about styles and uses, especially among Native Americans. And he'll be showing us some rather unusual examples later on in the show. But first, we have pushed his 3 dogs off the couch and settled in for some fun, and I guess the first question is, who is Bill Makowski?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Yeah. I'm laughing because I know that's true.
But for years we had a greenhouse garden center located in Old Town. It originally was called Dawn Till Done Farms. And during that time I always had a hobby of making pack baskets and snowshoes. I've had some absolutely wonderful, talented mentors. We sold that business about 14 years ago, and since then that's what I do full time is make pack baskets and snowshoes and fish creels. And
You're not entirely out of the business because you're surrounded by pumpkins.
Well, I still grow pumpkins. We still have a mail order Christmas wreath business. I still raise exhibition poultry, so I still got the farmer blood.
Yeah. So anyone who's driving by on Main Road in Milford on the way out towards Greenbush and see all those pumpkins on the left side of the road, that's you.
That's the identifying.
That's right.
That's the key identifier of the farm.
Now, you're not originally from Maine, although you're more of a Mainer than almost anybody else I know.
Well, always be from away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like I said, depends on who you talk to.
Yeah. But, I mean, you're in the woods all the time. You trap beaver, very much into the outdoor traditions, and you even supply equipment to the outdoor traditions, which is why we talked about pack baskets and stuff in the past.
Yeah, like I said, I've used them since I was just a young fella. I always had a pack basket, and as I got older, I had snowshoes, and my whole life has pretty much revolved around winter in the woods and trapping, and so they've really been tools of the trade, and that's what kind of got me interested in them at the time because of the the importance, particularly when you're talking 40 years ago, much different than it is now in the woods. So.
Mm-hmm. Is it because you couldn't find the tools? You couldn't, or basically you thought you could make them better?
Well, like in the case of the pack basket, I used to go over in Indian Island, and there was some very, very talented basket makers over there. Eugene Loring and Freddie Nicola, and I used to get a basket about every year. And of course, back then we snowshoed when we were trapping, and you had a lot of weight, a lot of traps. And you'd pretty much wear one out every winter. So after a period of years of doing this, and I got to know these guys a little bit when I was going over there and talking to them, Irving Ronco and some of these fellas, and I just decided I'd like to learn how to do this. And it's an interesting story. I had an old fellow up in Pasadumkeg, Willard Tilton, and I called him up. I had tried to find a basket maker, and that was willing to take some time and show me. And I was referred to Willard, and I called Willard up, and he said, "Certainly, you come right on up." And anyway, so Willard was quite a character, and originally from up around the Molunkus area, and he had a long family line of basket makers. His father and his grandfather had made baskets, and there's a lot of interesting stories go with that. But anyways, he's the one that got me started, and he taught me how to make baskets. So
yeah. Now, we did a show on basket making, and we talked about creels at that time. You showed me a little bit about snowshoe making, and some of it's bending wood to do what you want it to, so that much is the same. But after that, it diverges and things get really different.
Well, it's actually a case of trying to coax wood to do what you want it to do. And again, I had a very, very influential mentor, Dick McHubry, who Dick was at the university for most of his career, but that was his hobby, was making snowshoes. And again, I just was very, very fortunate. Dick, I had decided I wanted a little different style shoe because of what I was doing in the woods, and he said, why don't you come down and I'll teach you how to make them. At the time, he had kind of gotten out of this a little bit. So that was another absolute turning point in my life, and had a major impact on my life. But that's how I got started making shoes. And I spent 4 or 5 years making snowshoes and selling some here and locally. And I guess one of the other key turning points was at the same time I was learning to fly. And I had done a few excursions into northern Quebec. And like I said earlier, I think you really can look at snowshoes in two different veins. There's a parallel evolution, and the native style snowshoe, of course, going way, way, way back, way before the white man. But there's basically two styles of shoes, and there was almost a parallel evolution of these two styles, and you could almost do a show on either one of them. So.
You have probably a big collection of both, I'm going to guess?
Well, not both.
Nope, just one.
Just native shoes.
Okay. Yeah.
And kind of the background to that, what got me interested in that is at one point we were flying, my son-in-law was with me, and we had gone up to Baie-Comeau, Quebec at the time, and we were flying into northern Quebec with a fellow that got to be a very, very good friend of mine up there, Richard Trombley, who owned a flying service in Baie-Comeau. And we got kind of weathered in, and we actually were weathered in about 4 or 5 days, and we were just kind of hopping our way when we could get up enough ceiling to move. And one of the last places we found was a Cree winter camp on a lake up there. So we put in there, and we'd been 4 or 5 days, and we're pretty low on gear, and particularly Richard had no cigarettes left, so that we're in critical mode here. So the Cree always, when they leave a camp, they built a high platform and put all of their gear up on it, and they would cover it and leave it there, and they may come back in 1 year, 2 years, depending upon where they wintered. And Richard was kind of going through some stuff looking for tobacco, and he came across a pair of beautiful Cree snowshoes, and I was just mesmerized looking at them. The intricacy of the work and the design, and then I later found some others in the bush that had been broken that they had thrown away. And I was just captivated by the work, and having made snowshoes for 4 or 5 years, I understood the skill and the expertise that was required to make those. So we got back to Baie-Comeau, and I was telling one of the fellows that worked for Richard there about the snowshoes, and he was his name was Roland Marcoux. He was from down the coast, the Bas-Côte-Nord, and he said he knew an old snowshoe maker in Sept-Îles at one of the reserves there, and those are Montagnier. They're not Cree, they're Montagnier. Mm-hmm. So I said, I'd love to have a pair of those snowshoes, and he said, well, I'll go see him and see. Well, it went on 4 or 5 months, and he called, and he said, the old fella has your snowshoes ready, and he said, if I'll get them, I'll go pick them up, and I can send them to you. And I got to think, I said, I'd like to come pick them up myself. I'd like to see if I could pick them up. So I flew up, and we went to visit this old fella, and his name was Alexandre Michel, and you'd love to have been a fly on the wall for this one, Bob. But as it turned out, he was in a Cree village called Ushat-Molietinum, mm-hmm. and he spoke nothing but Montagnier, Innu. And he had a boy that spoke Innu and a little French. and Roland spoke a little French, or he spoke fluent French and a little English, and I spoke hardly any French at the time, and just English. So that exchange was four-way all day, but it was very interesting, and through sign languages and a lot of pictures drawn, we got the message across. But when I left there, I quickly had come to the realization that this is a real dying art, or dying life skill. That each village, and as it turned out, Alexander was the only one left in the village. There was some elders in the McKinsey family that made a few shoes, but he was the only one left that made any number of snowshoes. And at the time, he was in his late 70s, and it just became very evident that this is a life skill that is quickly fading.
We are in Milford, sitting on Bill Makowski's couch talking about snowshoes. And not just the snowshoes he makes, but the snowshoes everybody used to make if you wanted to survive in winter north of the 45th parallel. In fact, if not for snowshoes, it might have been impossible for Canada's First Nation people to even exist. Which opens up the question about which was really more important, the canoe or the snowshoe. Stand by, this is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. It's Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. I'm on a visit with Bill Makowski in Milford, and we're talking snowshoes today. Not until you step into a museum, or Bill Makowski's workshop out back, would you realize just how many different snowshoes have been made in North America, in styles that are hard to even imagine. Think about it, if you wanted to survive in a northern climate, with winters like the ones we have, or at least used to have, having the right snowshoes would keep you alive.
I've always felt that snowshoes have never really given their due. People are so enamored with canoes and the history of canoes and how that influenced,
Right.
The spread of civilization and the exploration of more land. But think of snowshoes and look at the habitat of the ecosystems that this opened up by being able to utilize snowshoes and having access to these areas at a time of year when you couldn't without the snowshoes. So I think that, just my feeling and all of the studying and research that I've done, that I think that snowshoes have every bit as much or probably more of an influence on the actual spread of civilization than canoes did. People just always seem to have taken those for granted. But
I think what puzzles me a little bit is you come across this winter camp for the Cree and find a good pair of snowshoes, and yet it's a dying art, and they must be difficult to make, and I'm surprised anybody would leave them behind. And
most of those native communities, that's kind of a disposable society. They traditionally were very, very mobile, and they made what they needed to survive in that location at that time. And then they traveled very lightly.
And they just left it there.
They just left it there, and they moved. And, they all possessed those skills. 100 years ago, every single Cree or Montagnais or Native American male knew how to make snowshoes. And every woman knew how to weave them. And it's interesting because once I realized this, I kind of got on a quest at that point to find some of these other snowshoe makers. And I was very successful locating these individuals, but it took a lot of flying and visiting but the interesting part of this is when I would talk to these individuals, or always, I would say the vast majority of the time had to have an interpreter, they all learned to make snowshoes almost osmotically, because they lived in these small, remote winter camps. They were continually working on things that was required for them to survive at the time, which meant patching, repairing, fixing snowshoes, making snowshoes. And the family unit was usually made up of the parents or two adults and maybe an extended family with a grandfather, a grandmother, or something, and a couple children and maybe a couple young children. So these children at the time, they always had tasks or chores or work, and you remember how the nights were long, and there was a lot of communal effort in some of the things they did, and they just watched how this was done. And I'd ask them, how did you learn to make shoes? And they would say, well, my father or my grandfather. And well, how did he show you this? And he'd say, no, you do this. And you'd watched it so long growing up that you just knew how it worked. That vehicle for passing that knowledge is no longer in place. Now, they may have a snowshoe class, or they may have an elder's workshop, and it's not a life skill. You think about it, you couldn't even go out and go to the bathroom without snowshoes. I mean, everything revolved around your ability to use them.
So now you make snowshoes for other people. Last I knew, you always have a backlog of requests. It takes a while. Someone orders snowshoes from you. It may be a little while because there's people in line ahead of them.
Yeah.
How far backed up are you now?
Well, I kind of make two different styles. I mean, two different, I don't want to say styles because I make, a lot of styles, 25 different particular styles. But the one that I make probably the most of is a working shoe, and that one is made with a solid ash bow, and it's strung with solid braid nylon and has several coats of resin on it. And it's designed for these guys. I make a lot of them for Prentice and Carlisle. I make them for Seven Islands. I make them for Herb Haynes's crews. They're a working shoe. You couldn't give these guys an old gut shoe, or a hide shoe. I mean, because they're on them 40 hours a week. They throw them in the back of the truck. Monday comes again. They want to get them out and go. And you have to treat this repeatedly. It has to be re-shellacked. And if it doesn't, the hide soaks up and it sags and it packs. Where the solid braid nylon or the resin is just it's maintenance free, and they last for years and years and years. I mean, they're just almost indestructible.
So how do you deal with that? You basically have traditional ways of making this, but new materials. What do you do? Well,
I mean, I think that people appreciate, and it's interesting because a guy told me one time. And I've heard a lot of people have tried the aluminum shoes and all these other things, and they end up going back to a more traditional shoe. Yeah. But it's I mean, there's always improvements on tradition, and I still make shoes, traditional shoes. There are people that just like them, that go walk around the back 40, or that just do a little hiking on them. But one a fella told to me, he said, if you like, you're really into the outdoor recreation, and you like the extreme sports and the snowshoeing, then these new, if you're playing in the woods, the new styles are perfect for what you're doing. If you're working, you need a traditional shoe. And that just kind of summed it up for me, So, but the old hide shoe was, that's what you consider, that's what you think of when you think of a snowshoe.
Right, the traditional ones we all grew up with.
Yeah.
What was the hide made out of?
Well, mostly the commercial shoes were all cowhide. The natives they were very, very, adaptable to whatever was available. I mean, in my collection, I've got everything from shoes made with bear hide to, but they used. I encountered a family from up in Newfoundland, in a little village up there called Piper's Hole, and their tradition was Micmac, but they also felt that they had some Bothic in their background. But these people were eel fishermen, and they strung their snowshoes with eel skin. Now, I mean, that sounds a little strange, but the Penobscots use eel skin for everything from dog harnesses to all kinds of things. Very, very durable, very tough, and very strong. But yeah, they're very, I guess, opportunistic in what they have. The preferred is caribou, because it can be cut so finely. And you remember they have a completely different set of snow conditions up there. It's a very fine snow, and it doesn't pack in those shoes. It's cold snow. But I've seen shoes out of bear hide and moose hide and fetal moose hide, and even bison. But and interestingly enough, the very best snowshoes are what they consider to be the very most durable and most applicable hide is beaver hide. Yeah, it doesn't soak up and it doesn't stretch. And the second most preferred is otter for stringing their snowshoes.
Didn't see that one coming.
Yep.
Maybe that's what's wrong with the snowshoes in my basement. No otter parts. Really, we have 1,000 years of snowshoe making history behind us, and yet most of what we can buy these days are made of plastic and aluminum. Is that an improvement? Bill Makowski is my guest, and I'm willing to bet he has an opinion on that when Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine returns on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Bill Makowski Traditionals is a one-man business operated out of Bill Makowski's workshop in Milford. Bill makes pack baskets and fishing creels and lots of snowshoes made to order, made the traditional way. We'll actually visit some ancient examples of this craft later in the show. Well, let's talk about the snowshoes that we're all rejecting, which is the aluminum and plastic ones that are commercially available. I've got 3 different pair in my basement, and I hate all 3.
Yeah.
It's like I will go out for a day in the snow and enjoy myself, but at the end of the day say, I just don't think I like snowshoeing.
You should have a 3-item yard sale.
Yeah, I think maybe so. And I know deep down inside that I'm missing something here because they're serviceable. You can have a little bit of fun with them, but you can't go very far or do very much, and they're not very adaptable to certain conditions.
Yeah, it's again, one size doesn't fit all for snowshoes. It depends on what what you're doing for an activity, what you expect of the shoe. If a fella is trapping or he's cutting lines or he's cruising timber, there's 2 things the primary thing that you need in the snowshoes is the flotation. And you get it one of 2 ways. You get it either length or width. You've got to have square inches to hold you up. And it's got to be proportional to what your size is. It also, there's some relevancy to what time of year you're using the shoes and what the snow conditions are like. But just in general, you got to have square inches, and that's determining what size of a person you are. So if you're doing a lot of turning and moving and back and forth, you need a shoe that's a little wider and a little narrower. The object of the tail on the shoe is keep the shoe trailing, so it's trailing straight when you're going. Well, if you're not doing a lot of straight running and you're doing a lot of turning, you can butt that tail right up pretty close. That's why you find a lot of, like, rabbit hunters love a bear paw, with a round back. And I make a shoe, probably the most popular shoe I make is it's a modified Maine shoe, and it's just been shortened up a little bit, widened out, and the tail's butted off to about 4 inches on that tail, blocked and butted off. But there's a bunch of different styles in the bear paw too. And if you're traveling any distance, if you're just out walking, you want as close to a narrow shoe because you're not walking splay-legged. It's just a lot easier on you, and as close to almost like a cross-country ski as you can get with a good toe lift on it so that it glides, and a good tail on it so it holds shoe's not flopping on your foot. That tail is down and dragging.
So if you're planning a day in the woods, or let's say a whole week in the woods, you're going up to camp or whatever, would you throw a bunch of different styles in the back of the pickup?
No, I think you'd just kind of figure out what you were going to do.
Yeah.
I think that modified Maine shoe is it's a good compromise.
So there's a range of traditional styles, and you've been sort of describing them, but how would you categorize all these? You've got your big round ones, you've got the long ones. There must be names to all of these, and there must be styles to all of these.
Well, yes, if you're looking at just a functional shoe like we use around here, a lot of them are, the name is self-determining on where it came from, like a Green Mountain shoe. It's narrow, it's round-tailed, it's relatively long, and that was designed for the going up the side of hills. When you go up snowshoes, you don't walk straight up a hill, or you go side by side as you're going. And that was what that was designed for. The Maine shoe, that's very similar to what they call a Michigan or a Maine. That one that evolved up here. Mm-hmm. And there used to be, in the development of the snowshoes right here in Maine. And of course, Maine is really kind of the cradle of snowshoes. All of the major snowshoe manufacturers have their roots here, from Dunham to Hosmer to Penobscot Snowshoe Company to Snowcraft. They all came or started here in Maine. Oh yeah.
Now,
Maine.
I certainly was. Yeah, I've always thought that canoe making was really a central part of the Maine tradition. Snowshoes, I would not necessarily put in the same category.
Most all of the commercial names of snowshoes started here in Maine. Tubbs, all of them. But before that, prior to that, each and every little community had their own snowshoe maker. Okay? Because Grand Lake Stream, Ellsworth Beach, and Bagley, and as you went around, the Nickerson in McLean and Passadumkeag, Nickerson in Greenbush, and there just were, every little community had a snowshoe maker. You had to get a snowshoe somewhere. Yeah. And this was before way before you had mail order houses, and that each little community had a snowshoe maker.
There are different styles. When you look at if someone just brought you a pair of snowshoes, would you be able to say, "Oh, that's made somewhere. This is that style. This comes from this Indian tradition or this Maine tradition"? Can you tell the style just by looking at a shoe?
Yes, and no. Some of them are very easy. Others, when an individual lived in Island Falls, it was making a snowshoe. 100 years ago, good chance I wouldn't know who it was.
If you took one of your shoes to an expert somewhere else, would he be able to look at it and say, "Oh, that's a Bill Makowski shoe"?
Sure, it's got my name on it.
Well, snowshoes are widely distributed, but construction and weaving varies tremendously, and it's not just the materials, but it's how it's weaved together, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and that's much more evident in the native shoes. And there's a whole story that kind of goes with that. The basic weaving pattern in it is a hexagonal weave, and they all weave in a pattern that kind of leads you through it as you're going. But over a period of time, the native makers developed some very unique weaving patterns that were just like the Atikamak and the Penobscot is a very unique snowshoe weave, and they got into some very intricate patterns in the weaving. And you have to remember, with the native culture, they didn't do anything just to do it. Everything had just a kind of a collage of rationale for everything. It might have been spiritual, it might have been functional, it might have been available, it might have been traditional. All of these things came into play when they made a snowshoe, and each and every one of them almost had, like the spiritual had maybe an overbalance of weight in the design of these shoes. So in their patterns, they wove these very intricate designs, all of which had meaning, all of which had, and it got so specific with some of that I could almost look at patterns and tell you what family made those. Yeah. Because this is a skill. Remember when I explained about how they spend their time in the winters, and this is all an osmotic pressure? Well, this was something that was passed on from mother to daughter to mother to daughter. So there wasn't a lot of outside influence unless they married into another family and something come in. So this is a pattern that might have been carried down for 6 or 7 generations because that's what they learned to do. So it became definitive of who made the shoes almost, or at least the family group that made the shoes.
So all this traveling, all this studying, all this making, does your wife encourage this or just tolerate it?
Can we move on?
Yeah, let's go out to the shop. Okay, take a moment to refill your coffee. We're heading out to Bill Makowski's workshop, and the first stop will be a display area filled with examples of snowshoes from all over North America. Now, I know what you grew up with for snowshoes, the long beaver tail things that look like tennis rackets, or maybe some bear claws. We ain't seen nothing yet. Meet you there in about 3 minutes. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Bill Makowski makes snowshoes. And if that was all he did, this would still be a fascinating show. But Bill studies not just how they're made, but where they're made. Winter conditions are different all across North America. The snowshoes you might want for deep powder are different than the ones you make to handle wet, wind-blown, hard-packed snow. And those are different than the snowshoes you would make for just general use around the winter campsite. And everything depends on what materials you have handy, because we have different trees and critters here in the east than they would out west. We're now back on the display room floor next to Bill's workshop. There are snowshoes of all shapes and sizes back here, some long and skinny with big tails so that you can walk long distances in snow, some fat and round so that you can float on powder while working around camp or working a trap line and brush. During the break, Bill has been talking about how different the styles can be. For instance, he's got an example here of a Penobscot snowshoe that dates back to about 1850, and it looks nothing like an Antiquimac snowshoe that he visited at a museum in Winnipeg that dates back to the same period. An example of that is right in front of us. It's a diamond-shaped snowshoe with very intricate weaving. This is Bill's recreation of the Antiquimac design in Manitoba, and it is really different.
Yeah, and all of that you see, all of that design work is all woven in. Each one of those is a twist in the babiche, and it's geometrically has to be exact.
Yeah.
Because you start in one position and everything finishes in the middle. And if you're off by just one strand, when you're weaving that, you almost have to be in a coma. I mean, you have to concentrate be so focused on, because if you miss, you don't know until you've gone like 3 more courses around, and then you've got to go back and take it all out and go back for your next twist.
And what we're really looking at here, I mean, people can remember the snowshoes they may have grown up with that were in the garage for all their lives, and that was fairly thick gut that was woven. This is all very fine material. This is like thin twine.
Oh yeah. It's almost like thread, and that's all. This is all deer hide, but you can see how each one of those is a twist in it. You see, and then it's just accented with a little. When you look at this, you can see the geometry in the front of that. And now this is a pair of. Go over here.
Yeah. Okay.
Now this is a pair of Penobscot. And you see the difference in the geometry? There's actually 3 patterns in there that you're weaving at one time instead of just the one. So you've got this. I
mean, this is very intricate stuff. It's not just going back and forth.
Yeah. You see, you've got actually 3 patterns in that, and this is extremely, extremely difficult. But anyways,
how would it take? Yeah, the guys probably bent the wood. The women did the weaving. Is that how it worked?
Basically, sometimes the guys did a little bit of this outer cord work, but the women did most all of the foot filling, and the toe and the heel.
How long would that have taken them?
Oh, I don't know. I know I just weaving that one pair. I've got 60 hours in just the weaving.
Yeah, that's painstaking
Yeah.
Can you watch Netflix at the same time you're weaving?
It's like I said, you're almost in a coma, focused. But I was telling you about shoes that were done for like a child's walking out ceremony.
Okay, yeah.
You see how ornate those are?
Exactly. This has lots of color in it.
Yeah, lots of color, and nothing particular unusual about the weaving, but lots of color. And
is that painted and dyed?
Yeah, those are. And even the old original, these are exact replicas, and the old ones were dyed too and painted.
This snowshoe we're looking at was made in the late 1800s with a lot of colors and some yarn around the edges. They're small for a child, but the snowshoes right next to them are large, and there are tufts of fur or wood along the edges, where the 2 shoes might touch while you're walking. Now, the Indians never would have wasted their time putting something on the edge of the shoe just for decoration, especially if it might get wet and heavy. There's got to be a reason. So Bill asked around.
And I never got any really good answers. And Fran and I were one time in the Yukon, and we were in a little village in Carmacks, Pelly Crossing in the Yukon. And there was a fellow by the name of Johnson Edwards, and I was talking with him about this. And I asked him about these, and he said those are there that makes the snowshoe quiet.
Ha ha. Okay, I figured there had to be a practical
bingo.
reason. There you go. All
bingo.
Right.
Makes the snowshoe quiet. What do you mean? And he said, well, long ago when we hunted, the way they hunt moose is they circle. The moose goes and they keep circling to try to get in front of it. They couldn't chase it because they can't keep up. They're trying to cut it off. And so anyways, he said when you run with the shoes, so that the shoes don't bang together and make noise, or don't bang the brush, and they don't make noise when you're running. And that made absolutely perfect sense. Since then, I've had it verified with some other individuals, but that's just an example of how everything had a purpose. It wasn't a decoration. It had a purpose. So interesting.
This puzzled me the last time I was in your shop too. These are relatively wide, maybe 16 to 18 inches. This one is like 2 feet wide. How do you walk in those?
Well,
you can't spread your legs that
there's
far.
some question. This is a recreation of one that's in the Museum of the American Indian.
That's as wide as the back of an Adirondack chair.
Yeah.
How do you walk in that?
It was collected by a fellow named Turner, the original, up in Ungava Bay. At the time, it was Fort Chimo, and so. There's only one pair in existence, and that's in the museum. So there's some question as to whether this was just done to appease this guy or whatever. But the reality of it is that in those conditions, when you get east of the Hudson Bay, east of the James Bay, you have a proliferation of these big, round shoes. The only place you find them. And it's because of the snow conditions there.
It's all powder dry.
That's right. In this country, and there's lots of it because it comes off that bay, okay? But these are much farther north, and this particular tail, if you see that, they call it a beaver tail.
Oh, yep.
Queue de castor in French. But that style is found only in eastern Quebec. And it goes all the way over to Labrador. The Innu, the Naskapi make that shoe, and this one over here is Cree. See that?
And that's not quite as wide, but pretty close.
That's right. But that's a functional pair of shoes. That would be a camp shoe. That's what they would use in camp to work. But the skill to bend that tail just as tight as it can be like that. And it seems to be the farther east you get into like Shahashit and Utsumashit and some of the other Innu villages east, it becomes a matter of I guess your skill as a snowshoe maker, how tight you can bend that little tail.
Now it's a matter of pride. Huh?
Yeah. So interesting. And I'll tell you another kind of a cute story. One time I was interviewing a fella up in Davis Inlet, and I had an interpreter, and I was asking. He was going through the questionnaire that I had, and in part of it, I had all of these sizes or these different style shoes drawn on there, and a lot of them were these round shoes. All have a name, Otipidosam, Opadasam, in each one of these, and he'd go through and what's the name of this part, and he'd have a thing. Finally came to the last picture, and it was a pair of Cree long, hunting shoes like this
with big upturned tips.
That's
at the front
right.
And tails.
And I had a translator that I was going through this, Etienne Pastowit, and I was going back and forth asking him. Then he'd ask him, and he'd come back. Finally, he pointed to this one and asked him what it was. And he said something, and everybody laughed. I'm thinking, what's that mean? What do you call that? What is that shoe? And Etienne looked at me and he said, "Ugly." He'd never seen a shoe that looked like this, and where they were always the round shoes. So, interesting story.
I'm in Bill Makowski's snowshoe showroom in Milford. Some of these examples out here are actual old shoes. Some are recreations. We've been talking a little bit about the fat shoes that you could barely walk in, but there are some other shoes here that are tall and skinny. I mean, really tall, taller than me. What's their story? Stand by. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Today's show is about snowshoes. There's probably somebody in the world who knows more about snowshoes than Bill Makowski in Milford, but I have not met that person yet. Bill has traveled North America soaking up everything about the various styles used by various tribes in various places, from Newfoundland to Alaska. Now, I know I've never seen anything as long as these.
Those shoes those are Duchesne shoes. They came from the drainage of the Yukon and Porcupine Rivers, and that's all big, open, flat country. And they just
so you just go straight.
It's not much different than And what's interesting about these too is you see these beads in it woven into it. Okay, those are the old. This is a recreation. These are old, original Hudson Bay trading beads. Okay, and the reason they put these on here is if you ever look at all of these old Indian camp, these pictures and so on, you can always tell which ones were staged for the photographer and which ones were real, because they always hung their snowshoes up. The dogs would eat the babiche out of them, so they never stuck them in the ground in front of the. So if you see them stuck in the ground, you know that somebody staged that. These particular shoes, they put these beads on and designed to tell not only about who owned them, but the status of the owner. So when these were hung up and they come into a camp, you saw those shoes, you knew who was there, and you knew his position. You know what your demeanor was to be when you entered the camp or went in.
Wow.
So I mean, they served all kinds of different purposes.
So would they have to rebeat it if you move up in rank?
Probably, yeah. Well, I'm sure they redid these every couple of years. You know.
Yeah. What would? Tell me about that maintenance. How much maintenance is involved in any of?
I don't think they maintained many of them. I think they just made new ones. Yeah. I mean, if it was just torn out weavings, they would use them, you know.
Yeah.
But they just would make new ones.
Now, so long as the ash is good, they can keep going. They just reweave.
Well, a lot of these aren't ash. You know, the only place to use ash is in this country where you could get at it. You know, they use brown ash. They use tamarack. They use birch as their preferred, but they use tamarack. They use on the west coast in British Columbia. They use maple. I mean, there's all kinds of. Depends, like I said, they're opportunistic what they've got to work with.
Well, some of that would influence style too, because some of this will bend and some of it won't do so well.
Yeah. So
on an ash, you can do a reasonably good job of bending it pretty tight.
Yeah, brown ash is good, but it's soft.
Yeah,
it doesn't. You know, and they were so detailed in their snowshoes that I met an old fella in Mastwiesh, which is Gerard Simone, which is a Innu community up in Lac Saint-Jean, and he told me about a shoe that they made when he was a young man, and it was what they called a Sigwansham, a spring snowshoe, and it was made out of yellow birch frames and beaver weaving and beaver babiche, and all of it was woven through the frame, nothing around the frame, and it was designed because the yellow birch doesn't soak up and. Of course, they didn't have anything to treat these with.
Right, yeah.
So it didn't soak up and get heavy. The beaver didn't stretch and pack because of the spring snow. In the morning in the spring snow, you've got that sugar snow, that crusty sugar snow. That's why everything was woven through the frame so you didn't wear the babiche off it in the first thing in the morning.
Okay.
So they had a rationale. I mean, you have to remember it isn't any different than you having a new car. Every time you get a new car, you change something, so it's a little better and a little better. You're working with it all the time. So
there must have been a lot of trial and error as these things evolved.
I'm sure.
Can you trace back? What do archaeologists trace back to the beginning of snowshoes? 10,000 years?
Oh, at least. Yeah. I mean, I think there's been some. I'm not totally up. I used to be up on it, but it changes so fast that But there was. I guess the most accepted theory now is there was a divergence between the development of the ski and the snowshoe somewhere along the lower Pacific coast, the lower Pacific rim, as civilization started to spread up north towards the the peninsula in Russia that comes over to Kimchatka. It comes up there. I don't know, but it is as civilization, and it started to divert left, farther to the west, which ended up being, up into the ski, and the snowshoe came across with the land bridge.
So let me turn you around to this pair here.
That's a pair I made.
Okay, you made that pair.
Yeah.
So
those are just made with cowhide.
Yeah, and there's not a whole lot of tip up to the front of it. There's a nice long tail.
Yeah, that's a traditional old Maine style snowshoe.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do people get in hold of you?
I've got a website. It's just Bill Makowski Traditionals. Or I think you can just Google me. I think it comes up there with the contact information and stuff. So.
Yeah. I have a pretty good idea of everything you do, and I don't know where you find the time.
Just keep moving.
You just keep moving.
But honestly, I get up every morning, and I'm excited about what I got to do.
Yeah.
I look forward to it. I enjoy it. I got enough other things, the chickens and the pumpkins, and that it gives you a little break in what you're doing, so it's fun. And then when the winter comes, I'm in the woods.
Yep. Well, Bill, once again, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I have thoroughly enjoyed what is now my second radio show with you here, and we should not wait another 2 years.
Well, I enjoy it. I enjoy talking to people that are interested in it, and that's what it's all about, is sharing it,
Well, in the back of my mind, I still have the idea of going out with you to trap beaver, so we'll talk.
We'll go.
Bill Makowski. Maine is a special place for the outdoors. Some of the best canoe making, snowshoe making, basket making in all of North America has happened right here for hundreds of years. And you can get a sense of that history just by sitting on Bill's couch. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. We'll return next Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. And remember, all shows are archived at 929theticket.com. This is Sports Radio 929 The Ticket.